1,000,000 voices. Hi, I'm Catia, and this is 1,000,000 Voices, where inspirational speakers share their stories and champion organizations that are making a difference in the world. Hello, welcome to a new episode of 1,000,000 Voices. Our guest today is one of the bravest women I know. Clarissa Ward is CNN's Chief International Correspondent and has won some of the most prestigious awards in journalism, including 7 Emmy Awards, 2 George Foster Peabody Awards, and 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards for distinguished journalism, just to name a few. Here's a quick look at some highlights from her amazing work reporting from conflict zones around the world.
I now give the floor to Clarissa Ward, CNN International Correspondent.
Thank you so much. I've been a war correspondent for more than 10 years in every terrible conflict that you can think of, but I have never seen anything on the scale like this. This is happening right here, right now. Life is dangerous. There are snipers all around. Is that what they want?
This is something you have to do.
This is one of the most unique environments on Earth.
How many hours have you been on the boat?
It's a humanitarian crisis growing by the day.
You've got to do justice to the story. How has your life been affected? I won't say you ever really make peace with it, but you can bear witness.
There are very little signs of normal human life.
You can't not feel some level of personal impact. Clarissa Ward, CNN, London.
Hi Clarissa, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's so good to have you here, to see you actually, even if it's from a distance. So, how are you? How is your family? I mean, this has been a very strange and difficult year, to say the least.
Yeah, you can say that again. Hi, Catia. It's very nice to see you. We are well. I had a baby this year, my second boy. He was born at the end of June, and I'm sure you can imagine it was a slightly strange time to be pregnant and giving birth. But no, we're blessed and we're doing well. We're just sort of putting one foot in front of the other and trying to live in the present as much as possible, because I think it's so difficult right now to project what's going to happen in the future.
Yes, I think that's this level of uncertainty is people are feeling it's very difficult. And I guess it's difficult also and challenging. It's a new challenge for journalists, right? To cover this kind of different war.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was telling someone the other day that I think this is the first war I've ever had to cover from my living room. Obviously, it's been compounded by the fact that I was pregnant, which really meant that I couldn't go and be in intensive care units in hospitals that were struggling to cope with COVID. But beyond that, I think, it's really forced all of us to re-examine how we tell stories, how we bring humanity to these stories, because at its core, this story is very tragic. Hundreds of thousands of people dead in the US alone. And how do we convey that loss, that human toll, when we're doing interviews over Zoom, when we are only able to look at people with masks on? And don't get me wrong, people should be wearing their masks, but it just makes it much harder as storytellers to convey the sense of humanity.
And it's very interesting what you just mentioned, Clarissa, about the human side, the human touch. That is very important to include that in the stories that you're telling as a journalist. And you have always tried to do that throughout your career. From, as you were reporting from conflict zones all around the world, you were trying to tell these human stories and hopefully build a bridge, create a connection, so people could at least try to understand the other side. And that is fascinating, and this comes across really well in your book. You recently wrote a memoir called On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist. And it is, I have to say, fascinating. I enjoyed reading it so much. I couldn't stop reading it. And I invite everyone who's watching us right now to read the book. And you can feel these human connections. I mean, not only with you as you were facing all these challenges as a war correspondent, but also with the people you created connections with in your life as you were, working in Syria and Yemen. There are passages there, Clarissa, when, I was almost crying at some point, and other times when I was laughing, because there is also a sense of humor. And like I said, there is always the human element. And I selected a passage actually that I'd like to read that I think summarizes very well your journey as well, the education of a journalist, as you reflect and as you think about the time when you were starting as a young reporter. You say, I had no sense at the time of what conflict reporting actually entailed. I didn't understand that straddling different worlds would require taking a wrecking ball to much of what I thought I knew about life, politically and personally. So tell us about that, this journey and the education of a journalist.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for saying nice things about the book. It's so always such a wonderful thing to hear that people have felt connected to it or connected to the characters in it. And I do think this is part of the reason I wrote this book, is because you see what happens in front of the camera. You see the stories that I put on television, and that's a big part of the job, obviously. But so much of what informs our opinion, our understanding of a conflict, of a crisis, of a people, of a place, actually comes from behind the camera. Moments of connection with random people, small acts of kindness or cruelty, even laughter. These are the rich moments that really inform or dictate the way one sees or understands the world. And I was desperate to have an outlet for that, to have a place where I could talk about that. And in some ways, the passage that you read out, which is about me essentially struggling with my sense of identity as a young, dual British American going out into the world and seeing the difference between the way we see ourselves and the way the world sees us, and trying to straddle those two worlds. Sharing that, I hope, allows people who maybe aren't slavishly following international affairs and policy and don't know the name of every one of the rebel groups in Syria, but still are curious about the world and still are open and receptive to that feeling of human connection or a shared humanity.
And it's fascinating because I felt very connected. Like I said, I felt very connected with you as I was reading the book. I could feel the challenges and the struggles that you were facing, but also I felt connected with the people you were talking about. But one interesting thing that I noticed, Clarissa, is that you often use two words, guilt and responsibility. So tell us about that, about feeling the constant feeling of guilt and also responsibility.
So guilt, I think, is, you can't not feel guilty if you go to these places and meet wonderful people. And at the end of your 3 weeks there, or your 3 days there, whatever it is, you are able to get up and get on a plane and leave and go back to London, or maybe you're going on holiday somewhere nice with your friends, all because you have a little blue or red passport that gives you this preferential status in the world. And it's completely arbitrary why you were born into this body, this country, this family, why you have this passport that allows you this freedom, and why somebody else has a passport that means that they're relegated to this conflict zone, that they don't have the opportunities that you do, that they face far more danger than you do. And I think when you really are confronted by that profound injustice on a regular basis through your work, it takes a while to be able to get your head around the unfairness of it. And you do feel guilt, and you do feel, how can I experience joy or allow myself to laugh or enjoy a delicious meal or a glass of wine or a beautiful view or time with friends and loved ones in a secure and happy environment when the people I was with last week are still being bombarded day in and day out. And so this is something that I think a lot of people who do this job really struggle with, is survivor's guilt or the guilt that comes with this privilege. And ultimately, you have to make peace with the guilt and let it go because it doesn't serve you at all. And if you're not able to, in those moments of respite or break from conflict zones, enjoy yourself, enjoy your family, enjoy your loved ones, and sort of fill up the tank emotionally, then you won't have the energy and the sort of longevity to keep going back and telling these stories. And responsibility, which you also mentioned, yeah, I mean, if someone's risking their life to tell you their story, you do feel a huge weight of responsibility that you need to do a great job, that you need to get a lot of attention, that you need to honor that person's story and do the best by it that you possibly can. And more broadly speaking, you have a responsibility to all those who are working with you in the field. You have a responsibility to anyone you put on camera who could face repercussions for that. So there's a lot of responsibility that comes with this job as well.
And also there is I think a point that you make about detachment as well. Mm-hmm. At some point you mentioned that it was a bit difficult sometimes to be a human, be a journalist, rather than, a human being. Like, for instance, when you were watching that man being beaten almost to death in front of you in China, and then you were with your crew there, but you couldn't really interfere, for instance. So how did you deal with that throughout your career?
It's, this is one of the inherent tensions in this job. And that is my primary role in any given situation, and particularly if it's a difficult or dangerous one where things are happening really quickly, is to get in, make sure my team's okay, make sure we all understand what our focus is, which is to gather as much video, as many interviews, or whatever it is that we need to make this piece work as quickly as possible, and then to get out as quickly as possible and make sure that everyone gets out safely. But of course, when you're in a moment, you feel terrible. Why am I not doing something to help? Why don't I put down the camera and go and help that person stand up? And why don't I put down the camera if a man is sobbing over the death of his son in front of me? Why don't I put down the camera for a minute and hold his hands and be a human being and wait for him to finish crying before we continue the interview? But if I'm trying to tell his story, if I'm trying to convey the full tragedy of his situation to an audience who aren't there with me in that moment, I can't put down the camera. It's part of the story. His grief is part of the story. If I put down the camera and wait for him to finish weeping before and allow him to collect himself, then it's not going to be as powerful. And so you're always feeling this kind of push-pull. Be a human, be a journalist. Make the person feel better, get the best story possible. And I think everyone has to decide for themselves, like what line you walk. And sometimes I've done things that are not technically professional. I've gone to a refugee camp and interviewed women, and then afterwards felt so moved by their story that, I will like anonymously give them sewing machines or something to help them with their lives. Now, you're not really supposed to do that. It's not unethical in the way that paying for an interview would be or something. But it's, again, you're kind of crossing a line and it's not really done. But sometimes you're going to have moments where you choose to be a human being as well. And I think that's okay. There
are several passages in the book that review a lot of this conflict and, as you were there. And sometimes you don't even have time to think as well. I mean, coming back to when you were starting out, your first assignment abroad was in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And that was a baptism by fire, wasn't it? I mean, already you realized your hotel was almost blown up, the hotel where you're staying in, and a lot of things. First time you did live TV as well. So lots of things were going on. Yeah, I mean, I was 25 years old. I had never been to a conflict zone in my life. I really had no business in a conflict zone, except we all have to start out somewhere. And I had done this hostile environments course, which had taught me how to tie a tourniquet if someone's limb, God forbid, was blown off, and how to duck for cover if there was artillery or, even small arms fire. But that was the extent of it. And I think when you're starting out, you really rely enormously on the wisdom and maturity and experience of people who've been in the business a lot longer than you. And you sort of know that your job is really to shut up,
keep your eyes and ears open, and just learn. And that was my overriding feeling that first trip to Iraq, and really the first couple of trips. I had never experienced that in my life, where I felt like bombarded 24/7 with new stimulus that I had never experienced, never seen, had no frame of reference for. And so you literally feel physically thrilled constantly by this wave of new information that is crashing over you, and you're just trying to get your breath and compartmentalize all this information and store it away. And you're definitely going to make a lot of mistakes on those first trips, but you're going to learn such a huge amount. And one of the reasons I love this job is that I think you're never done learning with this job. You're always learning more. You're always improving your skills, but nothing comes close to those first few assignments as a sort of young cub reporter or producer, as I started out, in terms of that learning curve, just like straight up like that. It's a unique experience.
And you continued learning, but then you arrived in Syria. And that was completely different from anything that you had experienced before.
Yeah, Syria was different because I had never seen a conflict like that, where it was such a David and Goliath dynamic, where you had a huge military with an air force with major international backers fighting a group of lightly armed, poorly trained fighters, where you had civilians being crushed in a way and deliberately and ruthlessly and systematically targeted, where you had hospitals being bombed, people being gassed, torture in these terrible prisons. I mean, I just had never seen anything like that. And I'd also never experienced a conflict where every single trip I did, and every time I went in, and every person I met, later on I would find out, oh, Ahmed disappeared one day. Oh, Razan was kidnapped one day. Oh, your friend Austin Tice has disappeared. Oh, Bulbul, who took you around, he was killed by a shell. I mean, on and on and on. The amount of death, destruction, loss. It was so profoundly painful, honestly, and so emotional and so personal in a way that I had not experienced covering a conflict before.
This is actually hell. This is what hell feels like. And there's no way it can get any worse than this.
This is basically what is left of rebel-held Aleppo after months and months of thousands of Russian bombs raining down on here. The streets are largely deserted, the buildings have been destroyed, and the people who once lived here have been pushed out.
I have been a war correspondent for more than 10 years. I have never seen anything on the scale of Aleppo. There are no winners in Aleppo.
And you were not embedded with, any military forces. You were not in a hotel. And that made a huge difference as well in the way that you were connecting with this conflict.
Yeah, because, if you think about it, I guess most people wouldn't necessarily know this if you're not sort of a journalist and doing this job. But normally when you're in the field, even if you're covering a conflict, you stay in a hotel, and there's probably a bunch of other journalists staying in this hotel too. And then every day you sort of drive up to the front lines. And what that does is it doesn't make it that it's not intense. It doesn't mean it's not dangerous or any of that. But it means that when you do get back to your hotel, even if it's a terrible hotel, you do have a little bit of distance from the day's events, a little bit of distance from the conflict itself, a moment to breathe and catch your breath or have a quick sleep. When we're in Syria, because we couldn't stay in hotels, we're living in people's homes. There is no separation. There is no distance. There is no personal space. There is no privacy, not just for me. Forget for me. I remember being with a family in Syria when they found out that the man of the house's brother had died, who lived in the house next door, and his whole family was in the room as well. And these women are wailing on the floor and tearing out clumps of your hair. And in any normal situation, I would feel like I should step out of the room. I should give these people some privacy, but there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere for. I was in their lives, experiencing their trauma vicariously. And I came to understand in Syria that that was part of the job, that bearing witness and being in those moments of profound suffering that they were experiencing, albeit as a spectator, and not turning away and not flinching and not retreating to the hotel, that was somehow part of the job, it's part of the responsibility.
And it's interesting because in your book, you mention that your work actually got better the closer you got to the people, to their living conditions, to the reality of war. And you are very honest and candid about the impact that those experiences were having on both your physical and mental health. And it's very refreshing, Clarissa, to read that and to see your honest account, because not often we see people who work in your field willing to talk about those things.
No, it's still, I think that's part of the reason I wrote about it. I sort of can't quite fathom how in this day and age, talking about the emotional toll of war is still something of a taboo. I mean, that is just bizarre to me. How anyone would assume that someone spends 15 years witnessing some of the worst acts of humanity and doesn't come away with a level of damage or trauma or grief or depression or whatever it might be from that experience is beyond me. Of course, we would all expect, just as we expect from a soldier who's been on the front line and experienced intense violence or trauma. It goes without saying, it's part of the territory. And I only wish that we don't all have to like hold hands and sort of stand in a circle and share our feelings. But we do need to be open about the fact that it does take a toll. And I tell young journalists this all the time. I say, when you start out, you feel like you're invincible. You don't realize that it takes a toll. But trust me, at some point, the check comes, okay? And so you need to be preemptive about this. You need to be checking in regularly with your mental health. You need to have a therapist. You don't have to see them all the time, but it's a really smart thing to have someone who you can talk to occasionally just to check in and make sure that you're doing okay and that you're processing things in a healthy way, because it's a lot. And so it was very hard to write about a lot of this stuff. It is very personal. It's very painful. But for me, it was not going to be genuine or authentic as a book if I was not able to talk candidly about, frankly, one of the most glaring realities of this profession.
And you can feel also that it was getting in the way of your relationship with your family, with your friends as well, right? So that sense of detachment, yes, again, because you brought that home.
You can't, it's very hard to not bring it home and to learn when to leave it at the front door and how to try to relate to your normal life when you get back from these kinds of trips and experiences. But it's hugely important to being able to do this in the long run, is being able, as I said before, to fill the tank when you're at home with love, with happiness, with joy, with fun, with pleasure, with food, with whatever spiritual, emotional, physical nourishment is good for you. That's what you should be embracing and indulging in. And that takes practice, and it takes a bit of discipline to get into that groove or to make that a habit that you keep. But it's really vitally important.
And it's great because you just mentioned that you often talk to young journalists or students, and they will certainly be inspired by this book and what you're opening up. Yeah. Because I wish, when I was studying journalism, nobody told me that. And in Brazil, we have a lot of situations that are very similar to conflict zones.
Yeah.
And I remember a lot of my colleagues really, suffering.
Yeah.
And so that's really great that you're saying those things. So what would be actually, because I always ask our guests here, their top tips, their advice for someone who's just starting out, young journalist or that student who's thinking, maybe also possibly fantasizing about becoming a conflict reporter, a war correspondent?
I mean, what I tell young people who want to do this job is that, it really is the greatest job there is, in my opinion. You have a front row seat on history. You get to see the best of humanity as well as the worst of humanity. And, it's an extraordinary privilege to be able to cross paths with different worlds and different people and places that you probably never would do in the course of your normal life. At the same time, it's extremely competitive and very difficult to get your foot in the door. And so I do tell people that, like, you have to want it very, very, very badly. If you don't have a strong passion, a strong fire burning in your belly to make this work, to make this happen, if you're not willing to work Christmas and Thanksgiving and New Year's Eve and whatever holiday might be sacred to you, you're probably not going to make it. Because it does require a lot of sacrifice, particularly with your personal life. You are going to have to live in places you probably would rather not live in. You're going to have to travel at times when you'd rather not travel. You're going to get phone calls at 3 a.m. saying, get up and go to the airport. You're going to miss school recitals and weddings and funerals and all of it. It comes at a cost. It comes at a price. It requires a huge commitment. And it can be really draining. So if you're willing, if that doesn't put you off, then great. This is the job for you. If that puts you off or gives you pause for thought, then you really should give it a few more beats before you make the decision.
It's interesting because when you were starting out, you were nagging your boss at Fox News. Can I go to Iraq? And then, they offered an assignment as well during specifically Christmas and New Year. And then you were like, yay!
Yay! I get to go to Baghdad for all the 3 big holidays. Excellent. This is so exciting. I've done Christmas in Afghanistan. I've done Christmas in Russia. I've done Christmas in Iraq. I mean, my point is, and I love Christmas, and for my family, it's a big deal, and we really, really celebrate it. And it's very painful to be away from them at Christmas time. The fact that I've done so many Christmases away from them is testimony to the fact that, like, for many, many years, my career came first. And in many ways, it still does. Although once you have kids, it does get a little more complicated. You have to strike a bit more of a balance.
But don't be afraid also to nag your boss. I think that's another.
No, definitely nag your boss. Because you know what'll happen? Eventually, you'll wear him down. It does work. Eventually, you will wear them down. Because, well, at a certain point, there won't be other people who want to go or whatever it might be. Like, you have to be persistent. You have to be ambitious. You have to be, there's a fine line between being your own advocate and pushing forcefully and consistently, but not to the point where, like, your boss really, really starts to hate you. So try to find that line and walk it with grace.
And it would be also interesting to talk about, Clarissa, how you establish a connection with sources that are not very easy to reach and under circumstances which quite often are dangerous or complex and not very straightforward. You won several awards for interviews that you have conducted. For example, when you were one of the first Western journalists to have access to rebel leaders in Syria, and you interviewed Western jihadis. And most recently, you went to Afghanistan and spoke with Taliban leaders. So those are circumstances that are not very, it requires, I can imagine, a lot of preparation. But not only that, but most of the time you have government officials watching you like hawks and ready to confiscate your material, for example. So how do you navigate those environments, and how do you prepare yourself for an interview like that?
So I think, you have to accept that some of these trips, they take months to organize and months to really build that trust and forge that sort of common understanding. It's not the same as making friends with someone, right? Because obviously you're not making friends with a jihadi, but what you are doing is finding common ground. You're finding basic things that you can both agree on. Things that might be red lines, or things that should be sacred, or things that you, particularly where it comes to security, that you can both say, okay, yes, we're on the same page here. And you can only really do that if you get to know a person a little bit, if you are able to get to the stage where they understand that, I may not condone the things that you do, but I'll be fair. When I tell your story, I'll be fair. I'll give you a fair shake. I'll listen to what you have to say. I'm not going to sensationalize it. I'm not going to make things up. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm not going to distort what you're saying. And similarly, I would need to understand from them, that I'm not going to kidnap you, for example. I do trust you. I'm willing to tell you something about my life that I wouldn't want other people to know, which then I can hold on to as something that could potentially, if things were bad, get me out of a sticky situation. So you're constantly sort of brokering agreements or making deals. In terms of the responsibility to, with where you're in a situation where your activities are being monitored, where you could be putting someone's life at risk, I'm very, very cautious about, I won't shoot someone's face, for example, if I could be putting their life at risk, even if they say they're willing to have their face on the camera. No, not going to do it. I don't want that or need that responsibility if something goes wrong and you end up dead in a ditch. And I think over time, having those kinds of ethics and being fair and agreeing to listen to people, even if you don't agree with what they're saying, that I hope gives you a certain level of credibility in this industry, and people see you as having integrity. And then in turn, that makes them more likely to talk to you. And also, I just think you have to be patient. Like so many of the stories I've done that have been, critically acclaimed or well received have been a product of like months and months of conversations and research and waiting and pushing things through slowly. And it doesn't always happen overnight, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all. And you've just wasted 2 months. But you have to be in it to win it. And I think that's something that's given me a little bit of a competitive advantage, is that often I am willing, where some of my other colleagues are not, to invest a lot of time into relationships that may or may not even be helpful to me.
And at the same time, precisely because you were trying to bring those different perspectives into your stories, and because you established those relationships, you gained a deeper knowledge of the complexity of the situation. You could understand what was going on the ground and what was happening in those conflict areas. So, and I think that's interesting, because most of the time people they tend to oversimplify perhaps and not really dig deeper. And you were able to do that through your stories.
Yes. No, of course. The problem you have sometimes, Catia, you start to realize is that often people are just looking for a simple narrative. And this is something I touch on towards the end of the book as well. Like, people are threatened by shades of gray. They want things to be black and white. They don't want to listen to the other. They don't want to humanize the other. It's simpler to live in a universe where it's black and white, and I'm white and they're black, and I'm good and they're bad, and evil is this, and and everything is clearly delineated. Of course, when you do the job I do and spend time in the places I do, you realize that things are much, much more complex than that. Which isn't to say that evil doesn't exist or goodness doesn't exist, and that we shouldn't occasionally take positions. But it's just to say that it's far more complex and complicated than I think many people appreciate or realize. And a big part of that is intentional, because there are a lot of people in the world who don't want you to see things in shades of gray. They want you just to have a very simple, basic understanding of the narrative.